Welcome back to Stories of Hammer. Today we're diving into one of the most horrifying scenarios in the grim darkness of the far future, a fate that combines the already terrible existence of a Dreadnought pilot with the chaotic, brutal ingenuity of the Orks. Imagine sleeping for nearly 5 millennia, only to wake up inside a walking tomb that's been turned into a grotesque parody of its former glory, covered in crude Ork modifications and thrust into battle against everything you once fought to protect. This is the nightmare we're exploring today. The scenario we're examining is both tragically plausible and deeply unsettling. Somewhere on a forgotten battlefield, a Space Marine Dreadnought has lain dormant for 4,750 years. That's not just a long time by human standards. That's longer than all of recorded human history on ancient Terra. When this warrior was entombed in his armored sarcophagus, the Imperium was a different place. Entire Space Marine chapters have risen and fallen in that span. Whole crusades have been fought and forgotten. Sectors of space have been conquered, lost, and reconquered. The Dreadnought pilot went to sleep when the galaxy was fighting wars that are now only legends, and he's about to wake up in the hands of the enemy. To understand the full horror of this situation, we need to establish what 4,750 years actually means in the context of Warhammer 40,000. For perspective, the oldest living Dreadnought in the Imperium is Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves, who has served for over 10,000 years since the time of the Horus Heresy. Bjorn fought alongside Primarchs. He knew the Emperor's sons as brothers in arms. He remembers when the Imperium was young and full of hope before the long descent into the current age of darkness and desperation. Our hypothetical Dreadnought pilot, having slept for 4,750 years, would have been entombed sometime in the middle 36th millennium. The Imperium at that time was already ancient by most standards, but it was a different beast than what exists in the current 42nd millennium. The technologies and tactics, the enemies and allies, the very shape of the political landscape would be almost unrecognizable to someone waking after such a span. But more than that, everyone he knew would be dust. His chapter might have changed beyond recognition, split into successor chapters, or even been declared lost or renegade. The battle brothers he fought alongside, the chapter master he served, the chaplains who performed his entombment ceremony, all of them would be long gone. Their names perhaps preserved in the chapter's records, but their faces and voices faded into the mists of time. The nature of the walking tomb. Before we can truly appreciate the horror of what happens when Orks get their hands on a Dreadnought, we need to understand exactly what a Dreadnought is and what it means to be entombed within one. These massive war machines are not simply armored suits or robots. They are something far more complex and, in many ways, far more terrible. A Dreadnought is a life support system wrapped in weaponry, a walking shrine that houses the broken body of a Space Marine hero who cannot be allowed to die. The process of becoming a Dreadnought begins with catastrophic injury. A Space Marine must be so severely wounded that even their enhanced biology and the advanced medical technology of the apothecaries cannot save them in any conventional sense. We're talking about injuries that would kill a normal human instantly, and that push even the incredible resilience of the Adeptus Astartes to its absolute limit. Shattered spines, crushed organs, limbs torn away, massive trauma that leaves the warrior unable to function, but with enough of their consciousness intact that their spirit still burns with the desire to serve the Emperor. When such a warrior falls, the chapter must make a decision. The easy path, the merciful path, would be to let them die with honor, to harvest their gene seed and allow their soul to pass into whatever afterlife awaits the Emperor's chosen. But for the greatest heroes, for those whose tactical knowledge is too valuable to lose or whose prowess in battle has become legendary, the chapter offers what they call an honor, but what is, in reality, a curse disguised as salvation. They offer the warrior continued service within the metal shell of a Dreadnought. The surgery required to enter a space marine within a dreadnought is extensive and brutal. The tech marines and tech priests work for hours, sometimes days, carefully preserving what remains of the warrior's body while removing everything that is too damaged to save. What's left, the essential core of the individual, is placed within a sarcophagus filled with amniotic fluids. Neural connections are established, running from the pilot's brain and nervous system into the dreadnought's control systems. These connections are so extensive and so intricate that the pilot essentially becomes the dreadnought, their thoughts translating directly into the war machine's movements. The technology involved is ancient, dating back to the Great Crusade and even earlier in some cases. Many chapters possess dreadnought patterns that they can no longer manufacture, relying on carefully maintained stockpiles of spare parts and the skills of master tech marines to keep their ancient warriors functioning. The sarcophagus itself is a marvel of engineering, maintaining the pilot's biological functions indefinitely through a combination of life support systems and the enhanced physiology of the Adeptus Astartes. In theory, a dreadnought pilot can live forever, serving their chapter through the millennia as an eternal guardian and warrior. But here's where the horror really begins to sink in. The human mind, even one as enhanced and conditioned as a space marine's, is not designed for this kind of existence. Imagine being trapped within a metal shell, unable to feel the sun on your face or the wind on your skin. You cannot eat or drink. You cannot sleep in any normal sense. Your only sensory input comes through mechanical sensors that translate the physical world into data streams your brain must learn to interpret. The sensation of walking is gone, replaced by the mechanical stride of a bipedal war machine. The feeling of holding a weapon in your hand is replaced by the electronic signals that control your dreadnought's massive guns and power fists. The psychological toll of this existence is immense. Many dreadnought pilots experience dyschronometria, a condition where their perception of time becomes severely distorted. Minutes might feel like hours. Days might compress into what feels like moments. The isolation is profound and crushing. While other space marines return to their chapter's fortress monastery between battles, sharing the brotherhood and camaraderie that defines the Adeptus Astartes, a dreadnought pilot has no such respite. They cannot participate in the daily rituals and training exercises. They cannot share meals with their brothers or engage in the quiet moments of fellowship that help maintain the bonds of chapter loyalty. This is why most chapters keep their dreadnoughts in stasis sleep when they're not needed for battle. It's presented as a practical measure, a way to preserve the ancient technology and conserve resources. But in truth, it's an act of mercy. The alternative, keeping a dreadnought pilot awake and active for extended periods, leads almost inevitably to madness. Some pilots, like Murderfang of the Space Wolves, have gone completely feral, their minds shattered by the weight of centuries spent in isolation. They are awakened only when the chapter needs pure, unthinking violence, and they are quickly returned to stasis before they can turn on their own battle brothers. The stasis sleep itself is not the peaceful rest that mortals experience. According to accounts from those who have experienced it, the stasis state is more like a void, an absence of consciousness so complete that when the pilot awakens, they often wonder if they ever existed at all. There are no dreams to provide comfort or distraction. There are no memories to revisit. There is simply nothing, a blank emptiness that can stretch for decades or even centuries between awakenings. When a dreadnought is awakened, the transition is jarring and disorienting. The pilot's consciousness is pulled from that void, and suddenly they must reorient themselves to the physical world through their mechanical senses. They must remember how to move, how to fight, how to communicate through the vocabulator that serves as their voice. And each time they wake, they find that more time has passed. Faces they knew are gone. Brothers they fought alongside are dead. The galaxy has moved on without them, and they are increasingly strangers in a world that no longer feels like home. This is the existence that awaits every Dreadnought pilot. It's a fate that some embrace with stoic acceptance, viewing it as their duty to continue serving the Emperor no matter the personal cost. Others struggle against the horror of what they've become, though they can never voice such doubts for fear of seeming weak or faithless. And a few, the truly ancient ones like Bjorn the Fell-Handed, have learned to endure with a kind of grim wisdom, accepting the burden while never forgetting the price they pay. Bjorn himself is awakened only in times of dire need or at the dawn of each new century to hold court at the great feast and recount elements from his own saga. He has been doing this for over 10,000 years, and while he maintains his clarity and wisdom better than almost any other Dreadnought pilot in the Imperium, even he admits that the loneliness cuts deeper than any blade. He has watched the Space Wolves chapter evolve over the millennia. He has seen thousands of battle brothers come and go. He remembers the Primarch Lehman Russ and the Emperor himself. But those memories grow increasingly distant, like half-remembered dreams from another lifetime. The extended neural interface required to pilot a Dreadnought causes immense mental stress. Conditions such as lethargy, confusion, and even senility are common among pilots who have served for extended periods. Some Dreadnoughts, particularly those who have fought for thousands of years, begin to lose their grasp on who they once were. They might confuse current battles with wars fought centuries ago. They might call out to battle brothers long dead, thinking them still alive and fighting at their side. They might wake from stasis believing they're still in the era of their original entombment, only to be confronted with a galaxy they no longer recognize. This gradual erosion of identity and memory is perhaps the cruelest aspect of being a Dreadnought. The warrior who was entombed all those years or centuries ago slowly fades away, replaced by something that is more machine than man, more weapon than person. Some chapters view this as a natural and even positive development, arguing that the pilot is becoming purer, shedding the weaknesses of flesh and emotion to become an avatar of the Emperor's wrath. But others see it for what it truly is, the slow death of everything that made that warrior an individual, leaving behind only the cold function of a weapon that happens to contain the ghost of a human consciousness. The Green Tide and its terrible ingenuity. Now that we understand what a Dreadnought truly is and what it means to be entombed within one, we need to turn our attention to the Orks, because understanding the Greenskins is essential to appreciating the full horror of what happens when they get their hands on such advanced Imperial technology. The Orks are, in many ways, the antithesis of everything the Imperium represents. Where humanity builds empires of order and hierarchy, the Orks create anarchic hordes driven by the simple joy of violence. Where the Imperium carefully preserves ancient knowledge and technology, the Orks bodge together whatever they can find and somehow make it work through a combination of crude engineering and collective psychic will. The Orks are possibly the most warlike species in the entire galaxy, which is saying something in a universe where war is the default state of existence for nearly every sentient race. But what makes the Orks unique is that they don't fight for conquest or survival or ideology. They fight because fighting is what they were created to do, and they genuinely enjoy it. An Ork lives for battle. The sound of gunfire and the clash of melee combat aren't sources of fear or stress for them. These are the things that make an Ork feel truly alive, that give their existence meaning and purpose. This mindset is hardwired into their very biology. The Orks were created by the Old Ones during the ancient war in heaven, as weapons against the Necrons and the C'tan. They were designed to be the perfect warrior race, capable of thriving in any environment, reproducing rapidly through spore-based propagation, and possessing an instinctive understanding of violence and warfare that would make them formidable soldiers even without formal training. The Old Ones succeeded beyond perhaps even their own expectations, creating a species so fundamentally geared toward conflict that the Orks have continued fighting for millions of years after their creators disappeared. One of the most fascinating and dangerous aspects of Ork biology is their collective psychic field. All orcs generate a low-level psychic energy that, when combined with the fields produced by other orcs, creates a gestalt effect that can actually influence reality. This is not magic in the traditional sense, and it's not as powerful as some exaggerated accounts might suggest, but it is very real and has significant implications for how orc technology functions. The orc gestalt field operates on the principle of collective belief influencing probability and function. An individual orc's belief that their weapon will work doesn't magically create function where none exists, but when thousands or millions of orcs collectively expect their ramshackle technology to operate in a certain way, that expectation can bridge gaps in engineering, compensate for faulty components, and generally make things work that by all rights shouldn't function at all. This is why an orc slugger that constantly misfires in the hands of an Imperial Guard trooper will fire reliably when wielded by an orc. The weapon itself is crude and unreliable by objective standards, but the orc gestalt field provides just enough psychic reinforcement to keep it functioning. This field also explains some of the more colorful aspects of orc culture, like their belief that painting vehicles red makes them go faster. To a rational observer, this seems like pure superstition. Paint color has no bearing on mechanical performance. But in the context of the orc gestalt field, if enough orcs believe that red vehicles are faster, then red vehicles genuinely do move faster when operated by orcs. The psychic field doesn't create speed from nothing, but it might cause the engine to run slightly more efficiently, reduce mechanical friction in ways that conventional physics can't explain, or otherwise provide small but cumulative benefits that add up to a measurable difference in performance. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean orc technology is entirely dependent on psychic phenomena. The Adeptus Mechanicus has captured and tested orc weapons and vehicles, and they've confirmed that orc engineering, while crude and unreliable, is based on sound principles. An orc mech boy doesn't just slap random parts together and hope the psychic field makes it work. They have real technical knowledge, instinctive understanding of mechanical principles, and genuine skill in working with available materials. The Gestalt field enhances and supplements this engineering, but it doesn't replace it. The Orcs' enthusiasm for looting is legendary throughout the galaxy. After every battle, Orc scavenger teams, called looters, swarm over the battlefield, collecting anything that looks useful or valuable. Weapons, armor, vehicles, ammunition, even enemy corpses. Everything is considered potential salvage. This isn't driven by practical necessity alone, though scavenged materials are certainly useful for an orc war machine. It's also a matter of pride and status. An orc who shows up to battle with a particularly impressive piece of looted gear gains respect from their fellows, and an orc mechboy who can take enemy technology and successfully incorporate it into orc war machines is held in especially high regard. Imperial vehicles are particularly prized by orc looters because they're sturdy enough to survive orc modifications and common enough that there's usually plenty of salvage available after any major engagement. Leman Russ battle tanks are favorites, with their robust construction and simple mechanical systems, making them ideal candidates for orcification. A captured Leman Russ will be stripped down, rebuilt with additional armor plates welded on at random angles, festooned with spikes and glyph-covered metal plates, and equipped with whatever weapons the mechs can cobble together. The result is something that barely resembles the original vehicle, but it works, and it works in a way that's uniquely orky. The Death Skulls clan has elevated looting to an art form, specializing in battlefield salvage and technical conversion. A Death Skulls warband might capture a vehicle, repair it, modify it, and deploy it in the same battle where they looted it, all in the span of a few hours. Their mechboys are incredibly skilled at rapid field modifications, and they have an almost supernatural ability to identify which parts of captured equipment are worth keeping and which can be replaced with orc components. But looting isn't just about vehicles and weapons. The orcs will loot anything they think might be useful or impressive. Space Marine helmets are prized trophies, proof that the bearer has bested one of the Imperium's finest warriors in combat. Orks have been known to loot entire buildings, tearing down Imperial structures to use the materials for their own ramshackle fortifications. They've looted ammunition of the wrong caliber for their weapons and somehow made it work anyway. They've even looted entire moons, using massive tractor beams and city-size rocket boosters to move celestial bodies, as Big Mech Fragrak, the Planet Smasher, demonstrated when he crashed a moon into the world of Taurabrax. The psychology behind this constant looting is deeply ingrained in Ork culture. An Ork sees a shiny piece of enemy equipment, and their immediate thought is not how to defend against it or how to study it, but how to make it theirs. This possessive instinct is so strong that Orks will sometimes start fighting amongst themselves over particularly impressive pieces of loot before the actual battle is even finished. It's a testament to the chaotic nature of Ork society that their warbands don't collapse into constant internal conflict over loot distribution, though to be fair, that does happen with some regularity. The Greenskins' approach to technology is fundamentally different from the Imperium's reverential treatment of machinery. Where the Adeptus Mechanicus sees each device as a sacred object, housing a machine spirit that must be properly appeased, the Orks view technology as tools to be used, modified, and improved through experimentation. If something doesn't work the way they want, they'll bash it with a wrench, add more dakka, paint it a different color, or weld on additional bits until it does what they need. This approach leads to a lot of explosions and catastrophic failures. But it also results in surprising innovations that more conservative species would never attempt. The Mech Boys' domain. At the heart of every Ork war effort are the Mech Boys, the technical specialists who turn piles of scrap and looted equipment into the war machines that make up the backbone of an Ork horde. Understanding what Mech Boys are and how they operate is crucial to understanding what might happen when they get their hands on a Dreadnought, because these greenskin engineers are far more capable than most Imperial observers give them credit for. Mech Boys are what the Orks call odd boys, specialist Orks who have innate talents and knowledge encoded into their genetics. This is a legacy of the Orks' creation by the Old Ones, who designed them with what Imperial scholars call the techno gene. As a Mech Boy grows and develops, this gene activates, flooding their mind with instinctive knowledge of mechanical principles, engineering techniques, and technological systems. They don't need to study or train to understand how engines work or how to build weapons. This knowledge simply emerges from within them, as natural and instinctive as breathing. This doesn't mean that all Mech Boys are equally skilled, or that their knowledge is comprehensive. Like any craft, the mechanical arts require practice and experience to truly master. A young mech might have the basic understanding of how to build a rocket launcher, but an experienced big mech has spent decades or even centuries refining their techniques, experimenting with different designs, and learning from both successes and spectacular failures. The most skilled mechs are capable of truly impressive feats of engineering, building massive stompers, gargants, and other war machines that can devastate entire armies. What makes Mech Boys particularly dangerous from the Imperium's perspective is their complete lack of respect for established principles of design and safety. An Imperial tech priest would never consider mounting a plasma reactor in a configuration that had a 60% chance of catastrophic failure, but a Mech Boy might do exactly that if they think the resulting explosion would be impressive enough. They experiment with technologies that more cautious species would never dare to touch. They combine systems that were never meant to work together. They push power outputs to levels that should cause immediate mechanical failure, relying on a combination of crude over-engineering and the Ork Gestalt field to keep everything from exploding until after the battle is won. The Mech Boys' workshop is a place of controlled chaos, or perhaps uncontrolled chaos, depending on how successful the mech is at managing their Gretchen assistants. These workshops are typically located in the heart of an Ork settlement or war camp, in whatever structure is large enough to house the current projects. The space will be filled with workbenches covered in parts and tools, forge fires for metalworking, welding stations that operate on principles that would make a tech priest weep, and piles of salvaged materials waiting to be incorporated into the next big project. Gretchen, the smaller cousins of the Orks, serve as assistants, laborers, and occasionally test subjects for the mech's latest inventions. They fetch tools, hold parts in place during assembly, and generally do all the tedious work that the mech considers beneath their attention. The relationship between a mech and their Gretchen is based on a combination of authority and terror. The Gretchen obey because they know the mech can and will beat them, or worse if they mess up, but they also develop a certain pride in working for a successful mech, especially one whose creations don't explode quite as often as the competition. When a mech boy takes on a particularly complex or ambitious project, they might work with other mechs, pooling their knowledge and resources. During a gathering horde or major battle campaign, multiple mechs will collaborate on truly massive constructions. This is how Gargants get built, those towering war machines that rival Imperial Titans in size and destructive power. Each mech contributes their own section, building systems and weapons according to their specialties, and somehow, through a combination of shouted arguments, occasional fistfights, and the unifying power of the growing horde energy, the various components come together into a barely functional whole. The mech's relationship with looted technology is interesting and complex. On one hand, they have deep respect for any piece of equipment that's proven itself effective in battle. A weapon that's killed a lot of enemies, or a vehicle that survived multiple engagements, earns a kind of status. And the mech will often try to preserve its most effective features even while making it more orky. On the other hand, mechs are fundamentally tinkerers. They can't resist the urge to improve, modify, and experiment. Even if something works perfectly as is, a mech will usually want to add more guns, more armor, more spikes, or that big red button that might do something interesting when pressed. This combination of respect for proven effectiveness and irresistible urge to tinker means that looted Imperial equipment goes through a transformation that's both pragmatic and creative. The mech will identify which parts of the original design are essential to function, what they call the good bits, and then they'll replace, modify, or supplement everything else according to their vision of what the machine should be. A looted Rhino armored transport might keep its basic drive system and armor frame, but gain additional plating covered in glyph work, a completely different weapon configuration, a reinforced ramming prow, and a coat of bright paint in the mech's preferred colors. The tools that mechs use are themselves fascinating examples of Ork technology. They have powered wrenches that can tighten or loosen bolts with pneumatic force. They have welding torches that operate on principles that seem to violate conservation of energy. They have various cutting and shaping tools, most of which would be considered horrendously unsafe by Imperial standards, but which work well enough for Ork purposes. Many of these tools are themselves products of mech innovation, devices that were built to solve specific problems and then became standard equipment in Ork workshops across the galaxy. One of the most important skills a mech possesses is the ability to work with diverse and incompatible materials. They might need to combine parts from 3 different types of Imperial vehicle, structural elements scavenged from Eldar wreckage, and components of pure Ork manufacture, all in the same project. This requires an intuitive understanding of how different materials and systems can be made to work together, even when conventional engineering wisdom says it's impossible. A mech doesn't approach this as a problem to be solved through careful calculation and planning. They approach it as a challenge to be overcome through brute force ingenuity, trial and error, and if all else fails, liberal application of rivets and welding. The mech's understanding of how technology works is instinctive rather than theoretical. They don't have formal education in physics or engineering principles. They don't calculate load tolerances or stress factors. They simply know, in their bones, that if they put part A and part B together in a certain configuration, the result will work in a particular way. This knowledge is not always perfect or precise, which is why Ork machines have such a high failure rate, but it's remarkably effective for allowing mechs to work with technologies they've never encountered before. This becomes especially relevant when we consider what happens when a mech encounters something as complex and advanced as a Space Marine Dreadnought. They're not going to understand the sophisticated neural interfaces, or the precise balance of the amniotic preservation fluids, or the intricate power distribution systems that keep a Dreadnought functioning. But they will recognize the basic components, the power plant, the weapon systems, the locomotion mechanisms, the armor plating, and they'll have ideas, lots of ideas, about how to make all of it more Orky. The discovery picture. The scene. A forgotten battlefield on a world whose name has long since been lost to Imperial records. The engagement that raged here happened thousands of years ago, so long ago that the very reason for the conflict has been forgotten. Perhaps it was a compliance action during one of the many crusades that have swept through this region of space. Perhaps it was a defensive battle against Xenos invaders. Perhaps it was something else entirely. The details don't matter anymore because everyone who fought here is dust, their bodies long since decomposed or consumed by the various scavengers and predators that inhabit this world. What remains is debris. Broken armor plates half buried in the soil. Spent shell casings so corroded that their original caliber is impossible to determine. The rusted skeleton of a vehicle, stripped of anything valuable centuries ago. And in the midst of all this ancient wreckage, partially concealed by vegetation that has grown over the decades, lies a Dreadnought. Its armor is pitted and scarred from the battle that brought it here. One of its weapon arms has been torn away completely, but the sarcophagus, the vital core that contains the pilot, remains intact. The life support systems, designed to function for millennia without maintenance, continue their silent work. Inside, suspended in amniotic fluids, the Space Marine sleeps his dreamless sleep, unaware that 4,750 years have passed since he last walked this world. Then the Orks arrive, a marauding warband, perhaps part of a larger campaign, or possibly just a roving band of freebooters looking for a good fight, crashes onto the planet in a spray of burning debris and poorly calculated landing trajectories. Their ramshackle ships tear through the atmosphere, shedding parts and belching smoke, somehow surviving impacts that would destroy properly engineered vessels. The Orks spill out onto the surface, whooping and hollering, immediately claiming the planet in the name of whichever warboss leads them, and setting about looking for something to fight. When there's no immediate enemy to engage, which is disappointing but not uncommon, the Orks turn their attention to what they do second best after fighting: looting. Teams of looters spread out across the landscape, searching for anything that might be valuable or interesting. Most of what they find is worthless, too corroded or damaged to be of any use even by Ork standards. But then, one team stumbles across the Dreadnought. The initial reaction is probably a mixture of excitement and confusion. The Orks recognize it as some kind of fighting machine, which automatically makes it interesting. The Space Marine iconography, even weathered and half buried, tells them this was an Imperial war engine, which makes it even more valuable as a trophy. But the Dreadnought isn't like the vehicles they usually loot. It's not immediately obvious how it works or what all the various components do. The sarcophagus in the center looks important, but they can't tell what's inside without cutting it open, which even the dimmest Ork realizes might damage whatever's in there. The looters call over their mech, because anything this complex requires someone with actual technical knowledge to assess. The mech examines the Dreadnought with growing interest. They walk around it, studying the weapon mounts, the power systems they can see through damaged armor plates, the articulation points for the legs. They knock on the sarcophagus and listen to the sound it makes. They peer into access panels and study the various cables and connections that run through the machine's interior. What the mech sees is potential. This is clearly a war machine of significant sophistication, built by the humies who make all those tanks and flyers that are so much fun to loot. It's bigger than a typical human vehicle and appears to be designed for close combat as well as ranged warfare, which is very orky indeed. The fact that it's clearly been damaged in battle only makes it more impressive. This thing fought hard before it went down. The mech can respect that. The decision is made quickly, as most Ork decisions are. They're taking this back to their camp. The logistics of actually moving a multi-ton war machine through difficult terrain without proper equipment doesn't concern them much. Some combination of brute strength, improvised lifting equipment, and creative problem-solving will get the job done. They get chains under the Dreadnought's chassis and start hauling, with dozens of Orks straining at the chains while others push from behind. Gretchens scramble around the edges, alternately helping and getting stepped on by their larger cousins. The journey back to the Ork camp takes hours, and it's accompanied by much arguing about what the war machine actually is and what they should do with it. Some Orks think it's some kind of special tank. Others insist it must be a type of armor that really big humies wear. A few, the ones who fought Space Marines before, recognize it as a Dreadnought, though their pronunciation of the word varies wildly, and they disagree on the specifics of what a Dreadnought actually does. By the time they drag the Dreadnought into the mech's workshop, a substantial crowd has gathered to see the prize. News spreads quickly through an Ork camp, especially news of something as interesting as a captured Imperial war machine. The local war boss comes to inspect it personally, nodding with satisfaction at this addition to their growing arsenal. Other mechs show up to offer their opinions, which leads to the usual shouted arguments about the best way to proceed. The dominant mech, the one whose workshop this is, and who therefore has first claim on the prize, starts by doing a thorough examination. They have Gretchen clean away the worst of the dirt and corrosion, so they can see the underlying systems more clearly. They open access panels and peer inside, tracing power conduits and trying to understand how everything connects. They try to activate the Dreadnought using the control systems they can identify, pushing buttons and pulling levers with predictable lack of success. The Dreadnought doesn't respond. It sits silent and still, its power plant in minimal standby mode, its pilot deep in stasis. The neural links that would allow the pilot to control the machine are inactive. The weapon systems are locked down. From the outside, it appears to be nothing more than a very sophisticated pile of scrap metal. But the mech is undeterred. They've worked with plenty of captured Imperial equipment that initially refused to cooperate. Sometimes you need to bypass security systems. Sometimes you need to hotwire the power supply. Sometimes you just need to hit things with a wrench until they start working. The mech calls for their tools and gets to work, determined to unlock the secrets of this Humie war machine and make it properly Orky. The mech's workshop. The mech boy's workshop becomes a hive of activity as work begins on the Dreadnought. Gretchens scurry back and forth, fetching tools and materials at their master's barked commands. Other mechs drop by to observe and offer unsolicited advice, which leads to the usual arguments about the best approach to take. The local war boss checks in periodically to see how the work is progressing, and to remind the mech that they want this thing ready for the next battle. The first order of business is getting the Dreadnought's basic systems operational. The mech prods at the power plant, trying to coax it into full activation. They bypass what they identify as security systems, though in reality, they're just cutting or removing components they don't understand. They hook up their own power sources to various systems to see what happens when energy flows through them. Some of these experiments result in sparks and small fires, which the Gretchen are responsible for putting out. Others produce interesting humming sounds or cause parts of the Dreadnought to twitch slightly, which the mech interprets as progress. The weapon systems receive particular attention because weapons are always a priority for Orks. The Dreadnought still has its assault cannon mounted on one arm, though it's clearly seen better days. The ammunition feed is damaged, and the barrels are corroded from millennia of exposure. The mech examines the weapon carefully, eventually deciding it's worth keeping, but needs significant modification. They replace the damaged feed mechanism with an Ork-built system that's cruder but more robust. They file down the corrosion in the barrels, though the resulting irregular bore will do interesting things to the weapon's accuracy. They hook the whole thing up to an ammunition supply they've cobbled together from several different sources, loading it with a mixture of different caliber rounds that technically shouldn't all fit in the same weapon. The missing weapon arm presents both a problem and an opportunity. The mech could try to repair or replace it with something approximating the original configuration, but where's the fun in that? Instead, they decide to build something new, something more in line with Ork aesthetics and combat doctrine. They start welding together a massive power claw, using structural members from looted Imperial vehicles and a power field generator salvaged from an Ork Def Dread that exploded last month. The resulting weapon is enormous even by Ork standards, a hulking monstrosity of metal and energy fields that will probably be devastating in close combat if it doesn't simply tear the arm mounting off the Dreadnought the first time it's used. As the mech works on the major systems, they make countless small modifications that change the Dreadnought's character in subtle and not so subtle ways. They weld on additional armor plates in places where they think the Dreadnought looks too weak or vulnerable. These plates don't match the original armor's composition or thickness, and they're attached at odd angles that disrupt the Dreadnought's carefully designed protection profile. But they make it look more intimidating, which is what really matters. They add spikes, lots of spikes, because Orks love spikes. They bolt on metal plates covered in Ork glyphs, some of which are actually meaningful symbols from Ork culture, while others are just decorative patterns that look cool. The paint job is a subject of much debate among the gathered Orks. Red makes things go faster, which would be useful for closing with the enemy. Yellow makes explosions bigger, which would enhance the Dreadnought's firepower. Blue is lucky. Purple is sneaky, though a massive war machine being sneaky is an amusing concept even by Ork standards. Eventually, the mech decides on a combination, painting different sections in different colors according to what they think each part should do. The legs get red because moving faster is always good. The weapons get yellow because bigger explosions are objectively better. Some bits get painted blue just for luck. The overall effect is a garish riot of clashing colors that would make any chapter's tech marines weep. During all this work, the mech becomes increasingly curious about the sarcophagus at the Dreadnought's core. They can tell it's important, possibly the most important part of the whole machine, but they can't figure out what it does. They try various methods to open it, or at least look inside, but the seals are designed to resist tampering, and even Ork ingenuity has its limits when dealing with technology they don't fully understand. Eventually, the mech decides that whatever's in there is probably meant to stay in there, at least for now. They can always cut it open later if they get really curious. What the mech doesn't realize is that some of their modifications have inadvertently begun to affect the stasis systems. The power plant alterations change the energy distribution throughout the Dreadnought. The rewiring they did to get various systems working disrupts the carefully maintained power flow to the sarcophagus. The vibrations from all the welding and hammering shake loose connections that have remained stable for nearly 5,000 years. None of these changes are enough to immediately shut down the stasis field, but they're degrading it, slowly bringing the pilot closer to consciousness. The work continues over several days, with the mech becoming increasingly obsessed with their project. Other tasks are delegated or ignored. Gretchen who don't move fast enough get kicked or hit with wrenches. Other mechs who offer criticism are invited to settle their disagreements the traditional way, with fists. The Dreadnought slowly transforms under their hands, becoming less and less like the noble war machine it once was, and more like something that belongs in an Ork warband. Additional modifications pile up. The mech adds a loudspeaker system salvaged from a destroyed Ork battle wagon, because if you're going to fight, you should be able to shout really loud while doing it. They install extra fuel tanks to extend the Dreadnought's operational range, though these tanks are not properly integrated with the fuel system and are held in place mostly by hope and welding. They add a rack of rockets to the back, because more Dakar is always better. even though firing these rockets will probably shower the Dreadnought itself with debris. The Ork gestalt field begins to interact with the modified Dreadnought in interesting ways. As more Orks gather around to watch the work and express their approval, the collective psychic energy of the warband starts to seep into the machine. This energy doesn't fundamentally change how the Dreadnought works, but it begins to smooth over some of the mech's cruder modifications, helping systems function together that really shouldn't be compatible. The ammunition feed that's jury-rigged from mismatched parts becomes slightly more reliable. The power claw's energy field, which should be unstable to the point of being dangerous, settles into something approaching functionality. The mech also makes one final addition that will prove significant later. They install what they call a motivator, essentially a crude electric shock system that can deliver painful stimulation to whatever's in the sarcophagus. The mech's reasoning is simple. If there is something alive in there, maybe shocking, it will wake it up, or at least make it respond. If there's nothing alive, well, the worst that happens is they've wasted some time installing a useless system. They hook the motivator up to a big red button on what serves as the Dreadnought's control panel, because Orks love big red buttons that do interesting things when pressed. The terrible awakening. Inside the sarcophagus, the Space Marine has been drifting in the void of stasis for what feels like no time at all. There are no dreams in this state, no sense of self or awareness of passing time. There is simply nothing, an absence so complete that it cannot even be called darkness, because darkness implies the potential for light. It is the closest thing to true non-existence that a living being can experience while still technically being alive. The first indication that something is changing comes as a distant sensation, so faint that it barely registers on the edges of consciousness. It's like hearing a sound from very far away or feeling a touch through many layers of insulation. The stasis field is weakening, and with its degradation comes the slow return of awareness. Time is still distorted at this stage. Seconds might feel like hours, or hours might compress into moments. But gradually, inexorably, consciousness begins to reassert itself. The Space Marine's mind, conditioned and enhanced though it is, struggles to make sense of what's happening. The last thing he remembers is battle. The enemy, their faces are hard to recall now, had broken through the lines. He was fighting, crushing enemies with his power fist, his assault cannon speaking its deadly song. Then there was pain, tremendous pain, and the world went away. When he woke before, there were tech priests and chaplains, familiar faces speaking familiar words about duty and honor and continued service. There was the disorientation of the first entombment, the strange sensation of experiencing the world through mechanical senses. And then there was the return to stasis, the long sleep that Dreadnought pilots know so well. But something is wrong with this awakening. The usual protocols aren't being followed. There's no gradual restoration of systems, no careful monitoring of his vital signs, no voices speaking high Gothic prayers and litanies. Instead, consciousness returns in fits and starts, like a machine being switched on and off repeatedly. The sensory feeds are chaotic and confused. Visual input flickers and distorts. Audio is a jumble of sounds he doesn't recognize. The neural interface that should allow him to move and fight feels sluggish and strange, as if the connections have been rewired in ways that don't quite match his expectations. Then the shock hits him. The motivator that the mech installed activates, sending a surge of electrical current through the pilot's body. Even within the protective fluids of the sarcophagus, the sensation is agonizing. The Space Marine's nervous system, connected through countless neural links to the Dreadnought's control systems, experiences the shock as if every nerve ending in his body is simultaneously being burned. He would scream if he had lungs and vocal cords in any conventional sense, but all that emerges is a burst of static through the Dreadnought's vocabulator. The mech, hearing this sound, whoops with delight. Something in the sarcophagus is definitely alive, and it's responding to stimulation. They hit the button again, sending another shock through the pilot's system. And again. Each shock brings the Space Marine closer to full consciousness, pulling him up from the depths of stasis through a process that's as painful as it is disorienting. Finally, full awareness returns. The Space Marine's consciousness floods back into his body, or what remains of it, and he begins to process the sensory information flooding through his neural links. Visual input first, a confused jumble of images that his brain struggles to interpret. The optical sensors are working, but the data they're providing doesn't make sense. He sees green skin, crude metal structures, orc glyphs. These observations take time to process, each one slowly clicking into place as his mind reorients itself to consciousness. His first coherent thought is confusion. Orcs. Why are there orcs in the chapter's armorium? But even as he thinks this, he realizes that he's not in the armorium. The visual feed shows him a workshop, but it's all wrong. The architecture is crude and ramshackle. There are no tech priests, no servitors, no familiar symbols of his chapter. Just orcs, dozens of them, crowding around and staring at him with their ugly, brutal faces contorted in expressions of excitement and satisfaction. The Space Marine tries to move, to stand, to ready his weapons. The neural interface responds, but sluggishly and not quite correctly. He commands his left arm to rise, and after a delay, it does. But the motion feels wrong. The weight distribution is different. The power fist that should be there has been replaced with something else, something cruder and heavier. He tries to activate his assault cannon, and he hears it spin up, but the sound is off, the rhythm irregular. His audio sensors bring him the sounds of orc voices, shouting in their crude language. He doesn't speak orc, but he's fought them enough times to recognize the tone of their speech. They're excited, triumphant, they're celebrating something. And slowly, with a growing sense of horror, he realizes what they're celebrating. They're celebrating him. They've captured him, modified him, and now they've successfully awakened him. The Space Marine tries to access his chronometer systems to determine how long he's been in stasis. The data comes back, but it's corrupted, or perhaps just so far outside his expected parameters that his mind initially rejects it. 4,750 years. The number doesn't make sense. It can't be right. But as he reviews the data multiple times, checking and rechecking, he's forced to accept the truth. He's been asleep for nearly 5 millennia. Everyone he knew is dead. His chapter, if it even still exists, would have changed beyond recognition. The galaxy itself has moved on without him. The psychological impact of this realization is staggering. Space Marines are conditioned to handle enormous stress and trauma, but this goes beyond anything in their training. The Space Marine has lost everything. His brothers, his mentors, the world he knew, all of it is gone. And worse, far worse, he's awakened not among friends, but in the hands of enemies who have turned him into something obscene. He begins to inventory the changes they've made to his body, his new body of metal and ceramite. The weapon systems are wrong. The armor configuration is wrong. He can feel additional weight in places where there should be none, and he's missing components that should be present. And then there are the cosmetic changes, the garish paint, the crude metal plates covered in orc glyphs. They've desecrated him, turned him from a noble war machine into a grotesque mockery of everything he once was. The mech approaches, studying the Dreadnought with satisfaction. They can see that whatever's inside is now awake and aware. The war machine's movements, tentative and confused though they are, prove that. The mech shouts something at the Dreadnought, presumably a command or instruction. But of course the Space Marine doesn't understand Orc. The Space Marine tries to speak, to demand answers, or at least to understand what's happening to him. His vocabulator activates, but the sound that emerges is distorted and harsh, processed through systems that have been modified by Orc hands. He manages to force out words in High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperium, but they sound wrong, even to his own audio sensors. "What have you done to me?" The question emerges as a mechanical rasp, barely comprehensible even in his own language. The Orcs, of course, don't understand High Gothic any better than he understands their language. They interpret his speech as some kind of machine noise, interesting but not meaningful. The mech pokes at the Dreadnought with a wrench, testing different components to see how the pilot responds. The Space Marine realizes, with growing despair, that communication is impossible. He's trapped in this metal shell, surrounded by enemies, unable to explain who he is or what's happened to him. Worse, he's beginning to understand what the Orks intend to do with him. They're going to use him as a weapon. They're going to force him to fight for them, to turn his guns and his strength against the very Imperium he's sworn to defend. He tries to resist, to shut down his systems, or at least to refuse to cooperate. But the neural interface doesn't work that way. His consciousness is too deeply integrated with the Dreadnought's control systems. He can't simply disconnect himself, and the Orks, if they notice his reluctance, have ways of encouraging cooperation. The motivator activates again, sending another shock through his system, and the pain is enough to force involuntary responses from the Dreadnought's motor systems. Over the following hours, as the Orks conduct further tests and modifications, the Space Marine begins to understand the full scope of his predicament. He's not just a prisoner. He's a tool, a weapon that the Orks have claimed and modified to suit their purposes. And there's nothing he can do about it. His only hope is that somehow, some way, he might be recovered by Imperial forces. But after 4,750 years lost on a forgotten battlefield, what are the chances that anyone even knows he exists? What are the chances that rescue will come before the Orks use him to kill his own brothers? The psychological torture of this situation goes beyond simple captivity. The Space Marine is being forced to participate in his own degradation. Every time he responds to Ork commands, every time the motivator forces him to move or fire his weapons in testing, he's complicit in his transformation from loyal servant of the Emperor into an Ork war machine. The shame of it, the horror, and the helplessness, these things weigh on him more heavily than the physical modifications ever could. He tries to maintain some core of his identity, to remember who he was before this nightmare began. He recites the prayers and litanies he learned as a neophyte, speaks the names of his chapter's heroes, recalls the battles he's fought in service to the Emperor. But with each passing hour, these memories feel more distant and less real. The only reality now is this metal tomb, these Ork captors, and the terrible knowledge that he will soon be forced to betray everything he's ever stood for. The Orkified war machine. After several more days of work and testing, the mech finally declares the project complete. The Dreadnought, or what it's become, now bears only a passing resemblance to the noble war machine it once was. The graceful lines of its original design have been buried under layers of crude Ork modifications. The imperial aquila that once marked it as a servant of the Emperor has been covered over with Ork glyphs. The careful color scheme that identified its chapter has been replaced with the garish paint job that the mech deemed appropriate. But the modifications go far deeper than mere aesthetics. The Dreadnought's entire operational profile has been altered in ways both obvious and subtle. The weapon systems, while still functionally similar to the originals, now behave differently. The assault cannon fires in bursts that are less controlled, but more devastating, spraying ammunition in a pattern that sacrifices accuracy for intimidation. The improvised power claw is a monstrosity of barely controlled energy, capable of ripping through armor, but just as likely to malfunction at a critical moment. The locomotion systems have been modified to be more aggressive in their movement patterns. The mech didn't like the careful, measured gait of the original Dreadnought design. They wanted something that moved more like an Ork, charging forward with wild enthusiasm rather than advancing with controlled precision. They've adjusted the servos and modified the balancing systems to allow for this more aggressive movement, though this comes at the cost of stability and fine control. Most significantly, though the mech doesn't fully understand what they've done, they've created a crude interface system that allows them to provide basic commands to the Dreadnought's pilot. It's not true control in the sense of direct neural command, but rather a series of painful stimuli that can encourage or discourage certain actions. The motivator serves as negative reinforcement, delivering shocks when the pilot doesn't respond as desired. Additional systems provide what the Ork might consider positive reinforcement. Mild electrical stimulation that's less painful and that the Orks have learned to associate with correct behavior. This crude conditioning system is horrifically effective. The Space Marine inside the sarcophagus quickly learns that resisting Ork commands brings pain, while compliance brings at least the cessation of torment. It's a degrading and dehumanizing system that reduces a noble warrior to something approaching a trained animal, but it works well enough for the Orks' purposes. They don't need sophisticated control systems or loyal cooperation. They just need the Dreadnought to point in the direction they indicate and kill what they tell it to kill. The Ork gestalt field has also begun to affect the Dreadnought in ways that are subtle but significant. The collective psychic energy of the warband, now focused on this impressive new addition to their arsenal, seeps into the machine's systems. It doesn't fundamentally change how things work. The Dreadnought is still operating on principles of mechanical and electrical engineering, but it smooths over incompatibilities and reduces the frequency of malfunctions. Systems that should fail regularly somehow keep working. Ammunition that shouldn't fit properly in the modified weapons somehow feeds correctly. The whole thing holds together better than it has any right to, sustained partly by Ork engineering and partly by the unconscious will of thousands of greenskins who believe it should work. From the Space Marine pilot's perspective, these changes are another layer of horror added to his nightmare existence. He can feel the Ork's psychic energy interacting with his Dreadnought shell, sense it in ways that he doesn't fully understand, but that fill him with revulsion. It's a corruption of everything his Dreadnought should be, a pollution of the sacred machine that's become his body. Every time the Gestalt field helps a system function that should be failing, every time the Ork's collective belief makes their crude modifications work better than they should, he feels it as a violation of his very being. The other Orks in the warband are enormously impressed with the mech's work. They crowd around to admire the modified Dreadnought, pointing out features they particularly like and suggesting additional improvements. Some of these suggestions get incorporated. More spikes are added. A ram is welded to the front. Additional armor plates get bolted on in places where the Orks think the machine looks too vulnerable. The Dreadnought has become a point of pride for the warband, a trophy that demonstrates their prowess and a weapon that will make them more formidable in future battles. The warboss claims personal ownership, decreeing that this war machine will fight in the vanguard of their forces, leading charges and crushing enemy defenses. The status boost from possessing such an impressive piece of looted equipment is significant, and the warboss makes sure that other Ork warbands in the region know about their prize. The mech, basking in the glory of having successfully converted such an advanced piece of Imperial technology, gives the Dreadnought a name in the Ork fashion. The exact translation into High Gothic is difficult, but it's something along the lines of smashy big shouty tin can, or perhaps crump stomper. The name is announced with great ceremony, shouted to the gathered Orks who respond with enthusiastic bellowing and the firing of weapons into the air. The Space Marine, hearing his new designation through his audio sensors, wants to rage against the indignity of it. He was once a hero of his chapter, a warrior whose deeds earned him the honor of continued service beyond death. Now he's reduced to this, a crudely named Ork weapon with a designation that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. But rage requires energy he doesn't have, and the psychological weight of his situation is crushing even his enhanced will to resist. During the final testing phase before the Dreadnought is considered ready for deployment, the mech runs it through various combat scenarios. The Space Marine is forced to fire his weapons at targets, to practice moving and turning, to demonstrate the power claw's crushing force on scrap metal and captured equipment. Each test is another humiliation, another forced participation in his own corruption. But he learns, because he has no choice but to learn, how to operate within the constraints of his modified form. he discovers the limits of his orkified systems. The assault cannon, with its modified ammunition feed and irregular firing pattern, is less accurate but produces more sustained fire. The power claw is devastatingly strong but slow to reset between strikes. His movement is faster but less stable, the aggressive gait forcing him to constantly adjust his balance. He catalogues all of this information because he's still, at his core, a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, and warriors gather intelligence even in the worst circumstances. Some small, desperate part of him hopes that understanding these modifications might someday help him escape, or at least allow him to resist more effectively. But mostly, he learns because it's what he's been conditioned to do for his entire existence as a space marine. Adapt, overcome, survive. Even when survival means continued existence in this nightmare, even when there seems to be no escape and no hope of rescue, he endures because that's what space marines do. The Orks, satisfied with their testing, begin preparations to deploy their new weapon in actual combat. Ammunition is stockpiled, though much of it is of questionable quality and mismatched calibers. Fuel tanks are topped off with whatever volatile liquids the Orks use for that purpose. Gretchen are assigned to follow the Dreadnought into battle, carrying additional ammunition and tools for field repairs. Everything is made ready for the coming fight, and the Dreadnought stands in the center of the workshop, waiting for orders that he knows will come all too soon. Battle and recognition. The opportunity for combat comes sooner than even the Orks expected. An Imperial patrol force, part of a planetary defense force garrison, has been tracking the Ork incursion and finally locates their encampment. The Imperials probably don't expect to find much more than a small raiding party, certainly nothing requiring reinforcement from off-world assets. They approach with confidence, their vehicles rolling across the landscape in proper formation. Their infantry taking up positions according to standard tactical doctrine. The Orks, naturally, are delighted. A fight is exactly what they wanted, and the fact that it's being delivered to them saves the effort of having to go looking for one. The warboss begins bellowing orders, and the warband mobilizes with the chaotic energy that characterizes Ork warfare. Vehicles roar to life, belching smoke and barely controlled explosions. Boys scramble to grab their weapons and pile into transports. The whole camp transforms from ramshackle settlement to mobile war machine in a matter of minutes. The Dreadnought is positioned in the center of the Ork formation, right behind the initial wave of vehicle attacks. The warboss wants maximum impact from their prize weapon. And what better way to demoralize the enemy than to hit them with a looted Dreadnought modified in the most offensive ways possible? The mech gives final instructions to the Gretchen handlers, reminding them to stay close and keep the Dreadnought supplied with ammunition. Inside the sarcophagus, the Space Marine feels the familiar surge of combat stimulation, the biochemical and neural processes that prepare a Dreadnought pilot for battle. But this time, the sensation is tainted by horror and shame. He's going into combat, but not in service to the Emperor. He's going to fight for Orks, against Imperial forces, against the very people he's sworn to protect. The wrongness of it threatens to overwhelm his sanity. He tries one last time to resist, to shut down his systems, or at least to move in ways that might sabotage the Orks' plans. But the motivator activates immediately, delivering such intense pain that his neural systems override conscious control. His Dreadnought body lurches forward, following the Ork advance whether he wills it or not. He's a passenger in his own form, forced to watch and feel as the Orks drive him toward battle against his own people. The initial clash is brutal and chaotic, as Ork engagements typically are. The Imperial forces, organized and disciplined, pour fire into the advancing greenskin horde. Lasguns and heavy bolters speak their familiar songs, cutting down Orks by the dozens. But the Orks keep coming, their numbers and enthusiasm overwhelming the defenders' firepower. Vehicles crash into Imperial lines, ramming through barricades and scattering infantry formations. And then, the Dreadnought enters the battle. The Space Marine can see through his optical sensors as the Imperial defenders first catch sight of him. There's a moment of confusion, That brief instant when minds struggle to process something unexpected. A dreadnought here. But it looks wrong. The paint is all wrong. The configuration is wrong. And it's fighting alongside the Orks, which can't be right, which doesn't make sense. But sensor recognition doesn't lie, and the Imperial forces quickly identify the threat. They redirect fire toward the dreadnought, lasergun beams splashing against its armor, heavy weapons attempting to find weak points in its defenses. The Space Marine feels the impacts through his dreadnought's damage sensors, cataloging each hit and assessing the threat level. None of these weapons can seriously threaten him, not the small arms fire anyway. But concentrated heavy weapons fire could eventually breach his armor. The Orks around him are shouting, encouraging him to charge, to fight, to kill. The motivator delivers measured shocks, painful reminders of what happens if he doesn't comply with their commands. And so, with a sense of bottomless despair, the Space Marine engages his former allies in combat. His assault cannon opens fire, and through the targeting systems he's forced to use, he watches as Imperial soldiers die. They're not Space Marines, just ordinary humans serving in the Planetary Defense Force. But they're his people, servants of the Emperor who don't deserve this fate. The assault cannon's modified firing pattern makes accuracy difficult, but volume of fire compensates. Bodies fall, torn apart by the heavy rounds. The power claw crushes a light vehicle. The crude Ork weapon proving devastatingly effective despite its improvised construction. The Space Marine can feel the resistance as the metal crumples, can hear the screams of the crew through his audio sensors. Each kill is a wound to his soul, a betrayal of everything he's ever stood for. The Imperial forces fight bravely, but they're overwhelmed. The combination of Ork numbers, vehicle support, and the Dreadnought's firepower is too much for their defensive position. They begin to fall back, attempting to conduct an organized withdrawal, but the Orks press their advantage, driving forward with savage glee. And then, in the chaos of battle, something changes. The Space Marine's optical sensors lock onto a new contact, and his enhanced cognitive processing identifies it instantly. Space Marines, a small squad, probably part of a larger strike force responding to reports of Ork activity in the region. They're advancing toward the battle, their power armor gleaming with chapter colors and heraldry. The Space Marine doesn't recognize the chapter. They're not his own, but it doesn't matter. These are his brothers in arms, fellow servants of the Emperor, and he's about to be forced to fight them. The recognition is mutual. The Space Marine squad's tactical displays have identified the Dreadnought, and there's a moment of hesitation as they process what they're seeing. Then their squad leader's voice cuts across the vox, clear and commanding even through the battlefield static. Brother Dreadnought, identify yourself and your chapter. You are operating in support of Xenos forces. This requires immediate explanation. The Space Marine tries to respond, to warn them, to explain the nightmare he's trapped in. But the Orks, seeing the new threat, are already responding. The motivator activates with greater intensity than ever before, forcing his systems into combat mode. His vocabulator tries to form words, but all that emerges is a garbled stream of static and distorted syllables. The Space Marine squad, interpreting this as either malfunction or hostility, makes the only logical decision. They open fire. Bolt rounds impact the Dreadnought's armor, each hit precisely placed to target weak points and vulnerable systems. These are not the scattered shots of panicked PDF troopers. These are Space Marines, warriors whose marksmanship is legendary, and they're attacking with full knowledge of a Dreadnought's vulnerabilities because they train alongside such machines in their own chapter. The Space Marine inside the Dreadnought feels each impact as a personal assault. His brothers are shooting at him, trying to destroy him, and from their perspective, they're absolutely right to do so. He's fighting for the enemy. He's become a traitor in function, if not in will. The shame of it burns worse than any weapon could. The Orks are ecstatic. A fight with other Hume warriors in fancy armor. This is exactly the kind of combat they live for. They drive the Dreadnought forward, using the motivator to force him to engage the Space Marine squad. The power claw swings, forcing the Space Marines to dodge and scatter. The assault cannon opens fire, though the Space Marine pilot deliberately aims wide, trying to miss despite the pain it brings him. The Space Marine squad leader recognizes something in the Dreadnought's behavior, some hesitation or irregularity that doesn't match normal Ork tactics. He orders a targeted strike at the Dreadnought's control systems, attempting to disable rather than destroy. A melter gun is brought to bear, its heat beam designed to punch through the heaviest armor. The Space Marine inside the Dreadnought sees the melter gun aim at him and feels a surge of desperate hope. If they can disable his locomotion systems, remove him from Ork control, perhaps there's a chance for rescue. Perhaps he can be recovered and returned to his own chapter, or at least be granted a clean death rather than this corrupted existence. But the Orks have no intention of losing their prize weapon. They pour fire at the Space Marine squad, forcing them to take cover and disrupting their targeting. Other Ork units move to support the Dreadnought, surrounding it with a wall of green flesh and crude armor. The tactical situation becomes impossible for the small Space Marine squad. They're outnumbered, outgunned, and the Dreadnought, whatever its reluctance, is still a devastating war machine in the Orks' control. The squad leader makes the difficult decision to fall back. They can't save the corrupted Dreadnought, not with current force disposition, but they can survive to report this situation to their chapter command. As they withdraw under covering fire, the squad leader transmits a final message in the general direction of the Dreadnought. "Emperor preserve you, brother. We will return for you." The words, heard through the Dreadnought's audio sensors, hit the trapped Space Marine with the force of a physical blow. They know. Despite everything, despite the Ork modifications and the forced combat, his brothers recognize that there's still a loyal servant of the Emperor inside this corrupted shell. They haven't abandoned him. They will return. But will they? How long will it take for them to mount a recovery operation? Will the Orks still have him by then, or will he be destroyed in some future battle before rescue can arrive? And even if they do return, even if they somehow manage to free him from Ork control, what then? Can he ever truly be restored after what's been done to him? Can he ever wash away the shame of having fought against Imperial forces, of having killed servants of the Emperor under Ork compulsion? These questions haunt him as the battle winds down. The Imperial forces have been driven off, at least temporarily. The Orks celebrate their victory, whooping and hollering and firing their weapons into the air. The war boss is particularly pleased with how their looted Dreadnought performed in its first real combat. The mech is already talking about further modifications to make it even more formidable. The Imperial response news of the corrupted Dreadnought spreads through Imperial command structures with the speed that only truly troubling intelligence can achieve. The Space Marine squad's report reaches their chapter's fortress monastery, where it's reviewed by the Master of the Forge and the chapter's senior leadership. The implications are serious enough that the information is forwarded to relevant authorities, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Inquisition, and any other chapters that might have lost a Dreadnought in this region of space. For the Adeptus Mechanicus in particular, the situation represents both a technological horror and a fascinating puzzle. A Dreadnought that's been dormant for 4,750 years represents priceless historical data. The technology involved, the construction techniques, the materials used, all of these things could provide insights into engineering practices from an earlier age when the Imperium's technical knowledge was more advanced. But more than that, the fact that Orks have successfully modified and activated the Dreadnought raises troubling questions about the security of sacred technologies. A tech priest contingent is dispatched to analyze the situation and, if possible, facilitate the Dreadnought's recovery. These tech priests, specialists in both Xenos technology and ancient Imperial systems, begin gathering whatever intelligence they can about the Ork warband that possesses the corrupted machine. Where are they operating? What are their movement patterns? What forces would be required to assault their position and recover the Dreadnought? The analysis quickly reveals that recovery will not be simple. The Ork war band has grown larger since acquiring the Dreadnought, its success in recent battles drawing more greenskins to the war boss's banner. They've fortified their primary encampment and established secondary positions throughout the region. Any assault would require significant Imperial forces, not just a small strike team, but potentially a full battle group with Space Marine support. The question of whether recovery is even possible in a functional sense also arises. The Orks have made extensive modifications to the Dreadnought systems. Some of these changes might be reversible, but others have likely caused permanent damage or alteration. The sarcophagus itself, the vital core that contains the pilot, has been subjected to unknown stresses and modifications. Even if the Dreadnought is recovered, can it be returned to proper Imperial service? Or would the kindest option be to extract the pilot, if they're still sane, and grant them the peace of final death? The pilot's identity, if it could be established, would help inform these decisions. The Adeptus Mechanicus begins searching through historical records, trying to match the Dreadnought's configuration and any visible chapter markings to known losses from 4,750 years ago. This is complicated by the Ork modifications that have covered or removed much of the original heraldry, but tech priest specialists are skilled at identifying even fragmentary evidence. Eventually, they find a probable match, a chapter whose records indicate the loss of a Dreadnought during a campaign in this region of space, approximately 4,750 years ago by current chronology. The engagement was recorded as a tactical defeat, with significant casualties and equipment losses. The Dreadnought was listed as destroyed, its sarcophagus presumably beyond recovery. But if the stasis systems survived the initial damage and the chapter's forces were driven off before they could properly secure the battlefield, it's plausible that the pilot survived in dormancy all these years. The chapter in question is contacted, and their response is immediate and unequivocal. If there is any possibility that one of their ancient heroes still lives, trapped in that corrupted shell, then they have a sacred duty to attempt his recovery. They begin mobilizing forces for a rescue operation, coordinating with the local Space Marine chapter and preparing for a major assault on the Ork position. But military operations at this scale require time to organize, and time is a luxury that may not be available. The Orks are nomadic by nature, and there's no guarantee they'll remain in their current location long enough for an assault to be mounted. Moreover, the longer the pilot remains under Ork control, the more combat he'll be forced to participate in, the more Imperial soldiers he'll be forced to kill. Each battle adds to his psychological trauma and to the shame he must bear. The Inquisition also takes an interest, though their concerns are of a different nature. A Space Marine Dreadnought that has been under Xenos control for an extended period represents a potential security risk. What if the Orks have implanted some form of control mechanism that could be used against the Imperium even after recovery? What if the pilot's mind has been so damaged by his ordeal that he's no longer trustworthy? The Inquisition doesn't necessarily advocate for the Dreadnought's destruction, but they do insist on thorough screening and evaluation before it could be returned to active service. These bureaucratic and theological debates play out in the halls of power while the Dreadnought pilot remains trapped in his nightmare existence. He has no knowledge of the efforts being made to rescue him, no awareness that his identity has been discovered and his chapter notified. All he knows is the ongoing horror of his situation, the continued forced service to the Orks, and the fading hope that rescue will somehow, impossibly, arrive before he's destroyed or goes completely mad. The Space Marine squad that first encountered the corrupted Dreadnought volunteers to serve as guides for any rescue operation. They've seen the Dreadnought in action, observed its behavior, and noted the hesitation in its combat patterns that suggests the pilot inside is still loyal despite his circumstances. Their testimony helps convince skeptics that recovery is worth attempting, that there truly is a faithful servant of the Emperor trapped within that orkified shell. Possible fates. The situation we've described could resolve in several different ways, and the fate of the captured Dreadnought pilot depends on numerous factors, from the tactical situation to the decisions made by Imperial commanders to sheer luck. Let's explore the most likely outcomes and their implications. The first possibility, and perhaps the one the pilot prays for most desperately, is successful recovery by Imperial forces. The rescue operation is launched. Multiple Space Marine units supported by elements of the Imperial Guard and Adeptus Mechanicus, conducting a coordinated assault on the Ork position. The fighting is fierce and costly, but the Imperial forces prevail. The Dreadnought is captured, disabled through targeted strikes that damage locomotion systems without destroying the sarcophagus. The pilot is extracted from Ork control and returned to Imperial custody. In this scenario, the pilot's ordeal is over, at least physically. He's returned to his chapter, where tech priests begin the long process of assessing what the Orks have done and determining what can be repaired or restored. The Orkified modifications are stripped away, replaced with proper Imperial components where possible. The sarcophagus is cleaned and reconsecrated with appropriate prayers and rituals, but the psychological scars remain. The pilot has experienced something that few Space Marines ever face: extended captivity and forced service to the enemy. He's killed Imperial soldiers under Xenos compulsion. He's borne the shame of corruption, even though it was inflicted against his will. These are burdens that even the mental conditioning of the Adeptus Astartes may not be sufficient to overcome. The chapter would need to decide how to handle their recovered brother. Can he return to active service, or has his experience rendered him unfit for the duties of a Dreadnought? Some chapters might view his continued service as a way for him to atone for the forced betrayal, to prove through future actions that his loyalty remains intact. Others might grant him final rest, acknowledging that what he's endured is beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. The Inquisition's involvement would complicate matters. Their screening process would be thorough and invasive, examining every aspect of the pilot's experience and mental state for any sign of corruption or compromise. Even if the pilot is found pure, the Inquisition might mandate restrictions on his future deployment or require ongoing monitoring. The stigma of this scrutiny could follow him for whatever remains of his existence. A second possibility is death in battle before rescue can arrive. The Orks continue to deploy their corrupted Dreadnought in combat, and eventually it encounters an enemy force powerful enough to destroy it. Perhaps it's another Space Marine force with better intelligence and preparation. Perhaps it's a Tau battlesuit team with sufficient firepower to breach the Dreadnought's armor. Perhaps it's simply the accumulation of damage over multiple engagements that finally overwhelms the improvised Ork repairs and modifications. In this scenario, the pilot's death would likely be a mercy compared to continued captivity. The final moments might even bring a measure of peace, the knowledge that his ordeal is ending and that he'll finally be free of the corrupted shell that's become his prison. From the Imperium's perspective, this outcome is unfortunate but not catastrophic. The loss of an ancient Dreadnought is regrettable, but at least it won't remain in enemy hands. The chapter whose brother was lost would conduct appropriate mourning rites, honoring the pilot for his final sacrifice and the suffering he endured. His name would be added to the rolls of honored dead, his story preserved as a cautionary tale about the horrors that can befall even the mightiest warriors. Future generations of Space Marines would learn of his fate and be reminded of the importance of securing fallen brothers, even in defeat. A third possibility is the pilot's complete mental breakdown under the strain of his situation. The psychological torture of forced service to the Orks, combined with the extended isolation inherent in being a Dreadnought, could push him past the breaking point. He might retreat into madness, his mind fracturing under stresses that even enhanced neurological conditioning can't overcome. In this scenario, the loyal Space Marine essentially dies, even though his body continues to function. What remains is something closer to a feral machine. responding to Ork commands through conditioned reflexes, but lacking any coherent consciousness or identity. The Orks might not even notice the difference, as long as their weapon continues to function in combat. They'd simply continue using the Dreadnought until it's destroyed or breaks down beyond their ability to repair. If Imperial forces eventually recovered the Dreadnought in this state, they'd face a tragic situation. The pilot's mind would be too damaged to restore, leaving only the biological remains suspended in the sarcophagus. The merciful option would be to grant him final death, ending the mockery of existence that his life has become. The Dreadnought chassis itself might be reconsecrated and prepared for a new pilot, but it would forever carry the taint of having been corrupted by Xenos hands. A fourth, darker possibility is that the Orks' modifications and the extended exposure to their gestalt field could begin to fundamentally alter the pilot in ways that go beyond simple psychological trauma. The collective psychic energy of thousands of Orks, focused on this war machine that they believe is theirs, might slowly erode the pilot's sense of identity and loyalty. This would not be chaos corruption in the traditional sense, but rather a gradual dissolution of self through constant immersion in an alien psychic field. Over time, the pilot might begin to think more like an Ork, to find combat exhilarating rather than dutiful, to embrace violence for its own sake rather than as a means to serve the Emperor. This transformation would be insidious precisely because it wouldn't feel like corruption. It would feel like finally understanding, like seeing the galaxy from a new and liberating perspective. If this process continued long enough, the pilot might eventually stop resisting Ork commands entirely, not because he's been conditioned through pain, but because he genuinely wants to fight. At that point, recovery would become not just difficult, but potentially dangerous. A Dreadnought pilot who's been psychologically assimilated into Ork culture could pose a serious threat if returned to Imperial service. A sleeper agent, not through deliberate subversion, but through fundamental alteration of personality and loyalty. A fifth possibility involves the Dreadnought becoming a legend, a ghost story told across this region of space. The corrupted war machine appears in battle after battle, always fighting for the Orks, always displaying that strange hesitation that suggests something human remains inside. Imperial forces learn to fear and pity it in equal measure. Space Marines who encounter it in combat feel the uncomfortable recognition that there but for the grace of the Emperor go they themselves. Years pass, perhaps decades or even centuries. The Ork war band that originally captured the Dreadnought is destroyed, but the machine itself survives, passing from one greenskin faction to another, always a prized possession, always an impressive trophy. The pilot inside experiences time in the fragmented way that Dreadnoughts do, brief periods of battle consciousness separated by spans of forced dormancy. He loses track of how long he's been in captivity. His memories of life before capture blur and fade. He becomes less a person and more a ghost, a consciousness haunting a corrupted shell, going through the motions of existence without any real hope or purpose. In this scenario, the pilot's ultimate fate remains uncertain. Perhaps he's finally destroyed in some climactic battle. Perhaps he's recovered by Imperial forces so long after his original capture that everyone who knew him is dead and his chapter has changed beyond recognition. Perhaps he simply continues on indefinitely, a tragic figure lost in the endless grinding machinery of war that defines the 41st millennium. Each of these possibilities carries its own particular horror. The first offers a hope of redemption, but at the cost of bearing terrible psychological scars. The second provides merciful release, but denies the pilot any chance at vindication or recovery. The third represents the complete loss of identity and dignity. The fourth suggests a corruption so subtle that the victim might not even recognize it happening. The fifth condemns the pilot to indefinite suffering without resolution or peace. The reality is that in the grim darkness of the far future, all of these fates are plausible. The galaxy is vast and cruel. Individual suffering, even the suffering of a Space Marine hero often goes unnoticed or unresolved. The Imperium tries to protect its own, tries to recover its lost soldiers and honor its fallen. But the sheer scale of constant warfare across millions of worlds means that some warriors slip through the cracks, their fates unknown and their struggles unwitnessed. The grimdark truth. What we've explored today is, in many ways, the epitome of what makes Warhammer 40,000 so distinctively dark. This isn't a universe where heroes always triumph or where suffering is always meaningful. It's a cosmos where even the mightiest warriors can be reduced to tools, where loyalty and honor can be perverted through forces beyond anyone's control, and where the ultimate fate of individuals, even legendary individuals, often remains unknown and unresolved. The scenario of an Ork-captured Dreadnought that's been dormant for nearly 5 millennia touches on several of the core themes that define the setting. There's the horror of immortality without purpose, embodied in the Dreadnought pilot, who sleeps through centuries only to wake to nightmare. There's the tragedy of obsolescence, as the pilot discovers that the galaxy has moved on without him and everything he knew is gone. There's the violation of the sacred, as Ork hands defile a war machine that represents the pinnacle of Imperial devotion and sacrifice. But perhaps, most fundamentally, this scenario illustrates the complete lack of agency that defines so much of existence in the 41st millennium. The Space Marine inside that Dreadnought has done everything right. He served faithfully. He fought bravely. He accepted entombment as his duty when he could no longer serve as a normal warrior. And yet, none of that protected him from this fate. Through sheer bad luck and the passage of time, he's been reduced to a slave of the very enemies he spent his life fighting. This lack of agency extends beyond just the pilot himself. His chapter couldn't protect him because they thought he was already dead. The Imperium's vast bureaucratic and military apparatus couldn't prevent this situation because it happened on a forgotten battlefield on an unimportant world. Even the Emperor, that distant figure that all Space Marines revere and serve, could not intercede because in the grim darkness of the far future, the Emperor has problems far beyond the fate of one individual warrior. The Orks, for their part, represent a different kind of horror in this scenario. They're not actively malicious or cruel in the way that Chaos forces are. They didn't capture the Dreadnought to torture its pilot or to corrupt him for dark purposes. They found an interesting piece of equipment, modified it to suit their needs, and put it to use in the way that seemed most practical. The suffering they've inflicted on the pilot is almost incidental to their actual goals. They probably don't even understand that there's a thinking, feeling being inside that sarcophagus, experiencing anguish at what's been done to him. This casual, almost innocent infliction of suffering is in some ways more disturbing than deliberate cruelty. At least with deliberate torture, there's an acknowledgement that the victim is a person capable of feeling pain. The Ork's treatment of the Dreadnought pilot reduces him to the level of equipment, something to be used and modified without any consideration for its inner experience. His pain doesn't matter because from the Ork perspective, it doesn't exist. The scenario also highlights the terrible consequences of being forgotten. If the Dreadnought had been lost on a battlefield that remained under Imperial control, if his chapter had been able to properly search the site of his last battle, he would have been recovered, or at least confirmed dead. But because the battle was a defeat and the battlefield was abandoned, he slipped into a liminal state, neither properly alive nor definitively dead, existing in a form of purgatory that lasted for nearly 5,000 years. This speaks to a larger truth about the Imperium. Despite its vast size and power, despite the countless millions of worlds under its dominion and the uncounted trillions of humans serving its cause, it cannot protect everyone. There are too many wars, too many worlds, too many individual tragedies occurring simultaneously. The Imperium does its best to honor its heroes and recover its fallen, but the sheer scale of its ongoing conflicts means that some warriors will inevitably be left behind, their fates unknown and their suffering unwitnessed. For the Dreadnought pilot in our scenario, this creates a profound existential crisis. He's been trained his entire life to believe that service to the Emperor is the highest purpose, that duty and honor are paramount, that the Imperium will remember and value his sacrifice. But now, he's confronted with the reality that the Imperium has forgotten him, that his sacrifice was meaningless in the grand scheme of things, that his suffering serves no purpose except to fuel Ork war efforts. How does a Space Marine reconcile that reality with everything he's been taught to believe? How does he maintain faith in the Emperor when the Emperor's Imperium has failed to protect him? These are not questions that have easy answers, and they're precisely the kind of philosophical and psychological challenges that make Warhammer 40,000 such rich material for storytelling. The physical modifications that the Orks have made to the Dreadnought serve as external symbols of internal violation. Each crude weld, each garish paint job, each improvised weapon system represents a layer of corruption applied to something that was once pure and sacred. The Dreadnought was a holy relic, a testament to the chapter's reverence for its heroes and their commitment to continued service. The Orkified version is a profane mockery, a perversion of everything the original machine represented. Yet underneath all those modifications, the core remains unchanged. The sarcophagus still contains a loyal Space Marine. The pilot's consciousness, though traumatized and despairing, still adheres to the oaths he swore and the values he was taught. The corruption is only skin deep, which in some ways makes it worse. If the pilot had been fundamentally changed, if the Ork's modifications had reached into his very soul and transformed him into something truly alien, then at least the violation would be complete. But instead, he remains himself, forced to watch as his body is used for purposes that betray everything he stands for. This dynamic creates a form of psychological torture that goes beyond simple captivity. The pilot is constantly aware of what he's become, constantly comparing his current degraded state to the glory he once embodied. Every time he looks at his own armored form through his optical sensors, he's reminded of what's been taken from him. Every time he hears Orks celebrating their possession of him, he's forced to confront his utter helplessness. The scenario we've explored today has no guaranteed happy ending. In fact, given the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, it's more likely to end in tragedy than triumph. But that's part of what makes the setting so compelling. It doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of its universe. It doesn't pretend that everything will work out for the best or that suffering always has purpose. Instead, it presents a cosmos where horror and tragedy are commonplace, where even the mightiest heroes can be brought low, and where the individual warrior's story might not have a satisfying conclusion. This uncompromising approach to storytelling creates a sense of genuine stakes. When we follow characters in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, we know that their survival and success are not guaranteed, that their struggles are real, and that their fates may be as dark and terrible as anything we can imagine. The Dreadnought pilot, trapped in Ork hands, represents thousands of similar stories, playing out across the galaxy. Warriors and heroes whose fates are unknown, whose suffering goes unwitnessed, whose names may never be remembered. He's a symbol of all the unsung tragedies that occur in the endless grinding machinery of war, all the individual hopes and dreams that are crushed under the weight of cosmic-scale conflict. And yet, even in this darkest of scenarios, there remains a spark of something that might be called hope, or if not hope, then at least defiance. The pilot hasn't given up entirely. He still resists, even though resistance brings pain. He still remembers his oaths and his identity, even though those memories hurt more than any physical wound. He endures, because that's what Space Marines do, because surrender is not in their nature, because even in the darkest moments, there remains the possibility that rescue might come, or that his suffering might somehow, impossibly, serve a greater purpose. This is the grim darkness of the far future, a place where there is only war, where hope is a rare and precious commodity, and where even the greatest heroes can be reduced to tragic figures whose stories may never reach a satisfying conclusion. It's a universe that doesn't flinch from depicting suffering, and that doesn't promise redemption for those who endure. Closing. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of the most horrifying scenarios in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The image of a dreadnought that's been dormant for 4,750 years, only to wake in the hands of Ork captors who have corrupted and modified his sacred form, is the kind of nightmare that perfectly embodies the grimdark nature of the setting. We've explored what dreadnoughts are and the psychological burden their pilots carry. We've examined Ork culture and their approach to looting and technology. We've walked through the terrifying process of discovery, modification, awakening, and forced combat that such a captured dreadnought might experience. And we've considered the various fates that might await this tragic figure, from rescue and redemption to destruction and madness. This scenario serves as a reminder of why the Warhammer 40,000 setting continues to captivate audiences decades after its creation. It's willing to explore genuinely dark themes and to present situations where there are no easy answers, where good people suffer through no fault of their own, and where the universe itself seems indifferent to individual pain. The Dreadnought pilot in our scenario is just one warrior among countless billions, one tragedy among infinite horrors. But his story matters because it illustrates fundamental truths about the setting and about the human condition in a universe defined by endless war. It shows us that even the mightiest can fall, that even the most sacred can be profaned, and that suffering doesn't always have meaning or purpose. If you found this exploration interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating content that dives deep into the lore and implications of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Let me know in the comments what other scenarios or topics you'd like to see explored in future videos. Until next time, remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And sometimes, that war claims victims in ways that are more terrible than death itself. Thank you for watching, and may the Emperor protect you.